So, traditional Jewish, Christian, or Muslim...
To understand atheist and agnostic...
Special guest today, everyone. Paige the dog is in on this recording.
After a traumatic day at the vet.
After a traumatic day at the vet. Yeah, that's not your water, though. That's my water. Yes. She's also very interested in our topic today, Preston.
Is she? That's good. I hope everyone else is, too.
So today on
the Holy Watermelon Podcast,
we're talking about why and how these religions we spent the last 2.5 months talking about died out. So everything from the Greeks to the Celtics to the Norse to the Egyptians.
All right.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about today.
Yeah. So there's a popular theory among religious scholars that there's kind of a natural progression to the growth and eventual death of religious traditions. That it usually starts with magic and then evolves into polytheism, then evolves into monotheism, and then just kind of gives out and is replaced by science. And I don't know if we really have enough examples of that sort of progression to validate the claims of this pattern. It feels a little bit weird. We're going to look into that as we go on. And also, when you say that magic gives way to all of these other models that also eventually disappear, that's kind of a pretty rude thing to tell a Wiccan, that their tradition is too primitive and on its way out.
Well, and then we get into the debate of what even is magic. You know,
Right.
Is it any pseudoscience? Because there's a lot of people who have pseudoscience-y jobs.
Well, and we keep coming up with new, weirder pseudosciences.
Right? So weird.
It's a mad world we live
Yeah.
in. And I have a problem with this model that so many people are convinced is just the cat's nipples.
Wow, maybe we just... Frigga would have liked that. Frigga? Not Frigga. Freya.
Frigga. It was Frigga.
Who's that? The cat? Is it?
I'm pretty sure.
No, I'm mistaking myself. I think it's Freya. They're debatably the same, so... Maybe we'll just have this endless cycle of magic and religion and never offload to science.
That would be really odd. I hope that science does continue to grow in popularity. We've got way too many people who deny science generally, categorically, as a rule. I know that every one of our listeners knows somebody who fits into that camp. And it's really frustrating.
Yeah, totally. I found this quote in an article from The Guardian when I was doing my research on how do religions die. And the author of the article, Andrew Brown, says, "There is a sense in which I can believe in Thor without this for a moment meaning what it would to a believer. So blasphemy can kill deities, and the measure of its success is that it comes not to be blasphemous at all." And I thought that was really interesting. Where the Thor movies are not blasphemous, but if you did the same thing to Jesus, they would be.
Yeah.
So, ergo, the Norse religion is well and truly dead, minus a few neo-pagans.
Yeah, pretty much.
So I thought that was an interesting litmus test, if you will, of if a religion is still thriving.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty solid. I like it. All right. So going back to this idea that there's a progression from magic to polytheism to monotheism into science, I want to look at a few things that look like they may be examples that validate this pattern claim. Naturally, I think we should start with Judeo-Christian monotheism.
Sure.
It's the thing that most of us are most familiar with. We know that anciently Judaism was either polytheistic or henotheistic. It's kind of tricky since we're mostly looking at archaeological artifacts, but we do know that in Israel, before the exile into Babylon, there were a lot of gods worshipped in the land. There is a distinction between El Elyon and Yahweh, and they of course had a consort that, depending on the source and where they're finding their artifacts, this consort belongs to one or the other. Her name is Ashura, the mother goddess. And there's other minor gods as well. And so there's definitely multiple gods, but whether or not there's a relationship with them that's henotheistic, polytheistic is hard to tell from archaeology.
From 5,000 years ago.
Right. And so we rely on the biblical text, which of course was edited post-exile to be, we're strictly monotheistic now. Tricky business. And of course, the bulk of Christianity claims a Jewish origin and also claims monotheism. Mostly. We've talked about how this is tricky. And so that seems like, honestly, the only strong basis for this model that people are really sticking to is that the Western culture as we know it had an origin in polytheism, is more or less monotheistic, and is giving way to science. And I can't think of any other really good specific example of that progression.
No, I mean, we've had this conversation. I just finished a really, really big book by Edward Rutherford called Sarum, and it's a historical fiction novel. But his citations, I listened to it, it was an audiobook. I swear his citations were like an hour and a half long. Like, it's very well researched.
Mm-hmm.
And put into a historical fiction format. And so Sarum is the entire history of the island of the United Kingdom.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it literally starts, like, in the Stone Ages, this book, and goes all the way to the 1800s, which is why it's 40 hours long. But to this point, they start with worshipping the sun god and goddess in the Stone Ages.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get the Druids, and then they go to Christianity. And Druids, you would say, would fall under magic.
Mm-hmm.
It's the opposite.
Most magical traditions that we look at do have at least one god.
Yeah.
And
I was
so
going to say that as well.
the polytheism doesn't disappear with the magic, but it does complicate the model.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm no historian, but I don't know any civilization that was purely based in magic.
Just magic with no gods? I can't think of any.
Yeah.
Even with all the research that we've been doing, I can't think of any at all.
Harry Potter. That's not real.
That's the trick. Fiction, you can come up with anything you want.
When Lord of the Rings has deities.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, there's... Again, if we're wrong, please put it in our Discord. But there's no civilization off the top of my head that just dabbled in magic exclusive of a higher power.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And since we got Egyptian religious tradition fresh in our minds, if you've been listening to our episodes as they come out, Atenism, I thought was...
Sorry. You were saying?
Atenism is actually kind of interesting, and it kind of looks like it might have almost followed this pattern. So Egyptian monotheism is such a weird idea when you look at what we know about the popular religion of the region. But it may have started out as henotheism, so it does kind of lend itself into this idea. Partway through his rule, Amenhotep IV announced that he was changing things up. He announced that Aten was the head of the national pantheon. Aten is kind of interesting. Most scholars just assume that it's another form of Ra because of its association with the sun. Even the name Aten is usually thought to mean just the disk, as in the sun disk in the sky. So if his people saw it that way, then it wouldn't really be a big deal. They would have just been like, yeah, it's Ra, okay. But I suspect that's not the case. And it'll become obvious why in a minute. So the pharaoh changed his name from Amenhotep to Akhenaten to recognize, hey, I'm fully devoted to this one god. His name previously had the name Amen in it, which was a different aspect of the sun god. So this was a meaningful change for him.
Wow. Yeah, changing your name's always a big deal.
Right.
That's why I didn't do it.
Fair enough. After a little while, Akhenaten, the pharaoh, banned all worship of the old gods. This is a big deal for a country.
Yep. Yep. And we'll see more examples of that as we go on.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then, luckily for the nation, this only lasted until his son, Tutankhaten, reversed everything and changed his name to Tutankhamen, King Tut, the famous boy king. In fact, there was a time, probably only 20 years ago, where that was the only Egyptian pharaoh that most people could name, unless they were Bible readers and could name Ramses.
Fair. I mean, if you put me on the spot, yeah.
King Tut and Ramses. If you can name more, you're an Egyptology nerd.
Oh, you're an Egyptologist. You actually have your degree at that point. Well done, you.
Yeah. So in the 1900s, scholars like Hugh Nibley and Sigmund Freud connected this short-lived religious phenomenon directly to the Israelite religious tradition in Egypt, which I thought was kind of interesting, that this may not have been a local thing, but a religious tradition brought in from outside of Egypt. It's tricky and complicated. Hugh Nibley and Sigmund Freud are actually on opposite ends of how it was connected to the Israelites, but it's all still pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. There are a couple of different issues that I've seen scholars have with this idea. The strongest kickbacks I've seen are questions of the timeline, or there's also a handful of armchair scholars who just refuse to believe that Moses was even a real person. And if Moses isn't real, then there's no reason to even have Israel in Egypt. Tricky scholarly stuff.
Right. For things that are so old.
Yeah.
You can't prove it.
Yeah. We've got stories, and the great thing about stories is you can either say, yeah, they're true, or no, they're not. And you can do that pretty freely. But since Atenism was terribly unpopular and very short-lived, there isn't really a lot outlining it for us. We know a little bit about their sacrifices, and that's almost it.
This is the episode on Animism right here. The last 10 minutes of talking.
Yeah,
that's it.
There's not a lot more to it. And so looking at Atenism, I don't it might fit well into that model of magic, polytheism, monotheism. It didn't get to science because the people largely reverted back to polytheism very quickly. But there's also that trick of, if it was an external influence, you can't call it a natural progression from one form to the next. It was a replacement deal.
Yes. And I know we're nowhere near the end of the episode, but I feel like my thesis is somewhere along the lines of that this is not a linear path.
No, not so much.
I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in the next 50, 60, 100 years, but some of these countries that are predominantly atheist, thinking off the top of my head of Scandinavia, they might pick up a new religion, or Christianity might make it come back. We don't know.
We can't know the future that well.
Also, I mean, obviously, I lean towards science and atheism, but they're going to be around for thousands of more years, to think that this is their final state.
Well, realistically, unlikely. We've always had people who doubted the existence of the gods, and among those, there was almost always at least somebody saying, you know what, I am so sure that these gods aren't real, but these traditions last anyway.
I think we'll all be together forever in this confusing relationship of religion.
Probably.
Which is why we need to learn to get along, people.
Right. So, and I did look up just broadly a survey of all monotheistic traditions throughout history. Mm-hmm. And there's a good handful of primal religions, little small native religions all over the planet that a lot of people keep calling monotheistic, and they're They're not. A lot of them are
I
henotheistic.
was going to say
And of the ones that are monotheistic, they've always been monotheistic. There's no evolution evidence at all. But of course, their records may be incomplete and maybe they were polytheistic beforehand. But those are just guesses that would be forced upon them by outsiders that I don't think could be legitimized. It's kind of frustrating.
yeah. Then we have animism. It definitely doesn't get covered a lot in academic discussion. Animism was common among underdeveloped civilizations, primitive civilizations. It is actually the foundation of the Egyptian tradition with all these animal-headed gods.
Right. But they weren't just animal-headed.
They were
originally animals. Wild animals interacted with people, and then people made offerings to those animals and or made deals with the spirits that controlled those animals. So the Egyptian gods were, as far as I can tell, really likely exclusively animal or human until after generations of ritual representation within the temple mystery schools, where a priest mage would wear a headdress, bearing the skull either embalmed or painted of the animal being represented.
Well, it makes a lot of sense if you think of the pairings of the animals with what the attributes of the god are.
For sure.
It makes perfect sense that they observe these animals' behaviors. The one that stands out, and now I can't remember, is the jackal.
Anubis.
Anubis, right?
Yeah.
So if you feed a jackal, they're not going to eat the dead people's bodies.
Right. Why would you work for bad food when you're receiving good food?
Therefore, you want your body to be whole into the afterlife. So if you give something to your local friendly jackals, your body will go whole into the afterlife. Makes sense to me.
Yeah. So I think animism is actually really interesting, and there are a good handful of scholars who have done a lot of really good work in that field, but it's not really addressed a lot when you're looking at how religious societies develop.
Part of the reasons religions ebb and flow is the function of religion in society.
Yeah.
And if it's not needed, which we're starting to see, overall, religion worldwide is declining. Though sometimes it doesn't feel like it.
The religious people are getting louder. For
Fewer,
sure.
but louder. So the ultimate pursuit of most religious traditions is to make sense of the world. We've also talked in the past about organizing society and people. So as Preston mentioned with animism, many gods are personifications of natural phenomena, and understanding them encourages life-preserving behavior. So this is why everyone worships the sun in some capacity.
You gotta pray for it to come back every
really
summer,
important.
every morning.
Right? Life would suck without the sun.
Mm-hmm.
There would actually be no life without the sun.
Correct.
That's a scientific fact.
Yeah.
Wrapped in religion.
So sun worship is scientifically validated.
Oh dear. Settle down.
If you use both the word scientifically and validated loosely.
Many gods are memories of ancestors, rulers, teachers. We talked about this a million years ago, it feels, in our worship episode. And understanding these people guides followers to safety and knowledge. And when you venerate a person, it tells you that their teachings are really, really important and you should listen, as opposed to just your mom telling you something.
Right. You can get mad at your mom and stop listening. Getting mad at a figure that you don't get to interact with happens less.
And
not that it doesn't happen.
Regardless.
Sure.
Most polytheistic religions combine the two, the personification of nature and the ancestor worship. There are myths, and religions are also used to explain the origin of things in the beginning.
Yeah. We got myths for the origins of humanity. The Greeks had that fun myth about the origin of spiders.
The one about ejaculating water.
Right? All kinds of really great stories on where things came from.
Very creative. Very creative.
Yeah.
And most religions discuss what happens to us when we die. So again, this is just to help people organize their lives in the world and society. And so we can see, again, in societies where religion is declining, we don't need religion to help us organize things anymore.
Right. And sometimes we've got things that we just don't feel the need to explain. If you don't exist anymore after you're dead, you don't need an explanation beyond that. It's fairly simple. Of course, there are exceptions to the cosmological function of religion. There are plenty of examples of religions that exist just to gain control over people or to gain personal power.
Danger
Scientology is a great example.
I was going to say danger cult. Okay. If you want to call it Scientology, I agree with you.
And there's loads of examples of these dangerous religious traditions. And it's frustrating to suss out the difference sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then I wrote a couple points on religious violence with the attempt to exterminate a religious group. I couldn't find any that were successful, which I guess is cool. And I actually couldn't find a lot of examples. I did read a little bit around Buddhists being run out of India. The Buddhism started in India. It's a very minor religion there now. And then, of course, more recently, the Crusades. There were lots of crusades. That's probably an entire episode on its own, but it was basically predominantly Christians killing Muslims to spread Christianity.
And vice versa. And Muslims killing Christians to spread Islam.
All right.
But for the most part, it was, hey, we need to take back the Holy Land from the Muslims.
Well, and when you hear the term the Crusades, you hear of
Yeah.
it's a Christian connotation. But you're right. Everyone's been trying to kill everyone. And then even more recently, of course, the Holocaust, which killed far too many Jewish people. And it was only recently that the Jewish population recovered. Like in the last, I think, 5 or 6 years? The Jewish population is now what it was pre-Holocaust. So while they didn't kill off the Jewish population, there have been Jews around the world since the 1940s. They did put a big dent in it.
Yeah. All right. So looking again at how some of these religions that we've been talking about have successfully been wiped away, mostly it involves Christianity.
Good old JC.
Christianity enforces strict adherence to monotheism in most situations, most traditions. Don't really want to talk about the Trinity today, but there will come a time. It doesn't really allow for a lot of syncretic amalgamation, like we saw among the Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians, but we'll talk more about that later too, that there is a little bit of syncretic work going on. Part of the problem is that these ancient polytheistic religions were very syncretic. They were cool with Jesus. If you say that you have another God, cool, let's talk about him. But the Christians weren't very cool with sharing that light.
So there's a reason monogamy and monotheism start with the same prefix.
Yes, just one.
It's just one forever. One dick for life.
Yes.
Preston's very uncomfortable with that comment. I'm so sorry.
The Christian God did want an exclusive relationship. No other gods before me, very often quoted part of the Old Testament. That's really the deal.
So we're going to get into each of the 5 that we've talked about over the last few months and what happened and dates and people and events. But it's really hard to pin a solid date down because so many of these had small regional traditions that kept going after the urban centers were Christianized. And syncretism allowed a blending of traditions, old traditions with new traditions. So it was a very gradual Christianization of the world. And then there's always did any of these really die out? This kind of comes back to my Thor point at the beginning, but also we have, records that there have always been small pockets of these pagans basically forever. And then with the internet, they get even more popular.
Yeah. All right. So let's start with the Greeks, just like we did a couple months ago. We know that there was this strong polytheistic tradition. Don't know why I blanked on the word there for a second. I guess I've said it too many times.
For 3 months.
All right. So, interestingly enough, there's this fella named Xenophanes of Colophon, who was a Greek thinker, and he just didn't really believe in the popular pantheon. He said a few things that looked vaguely monotheistic sometimes, if you're inclined to interpret him that way. Kind of tricky business. And of course, there were a lot of other Greek philosophers and even oracles eventually started talking about a sort of pantheism behind the Olympians. So the trick with this is that I'm just not inclined to think that it's a fully naturally Greek phenomenon, because it all happened after exposure to Judeo-Christian monotheism, which kind of undercuts the homegrownness of the idea.
Yep. I'm picking up what you're laying down. So for the decline of the Greek and Roman religions, I've actually lumped them together. Because one led to the other.
Well, and in Rome and under the Roman Empire, they basically were one lump. By the time that they disappeared, they were one lump.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the Roman Republic conquered Greece in 146 BCE, which led to the syncretization of their pantheons.
Yeah.
So already the Greek, I'm sure there are still people who called Jupiter Zeus and...
Oh, absolutely. If you spoke Greek, it was Zeus. It doesn't matter whose god it was.
Yeah.
But if you were Roman, it was Jupiter, no matter who he belonged to.
But because of this event, their declines are now the same.
Yep.
So their traditions came roughly to an end in the 9th century when the last believers were converted to Christianity. Constantine I was a Roman emperor and the first of the Roman emperors to convert to Christianity. In 313 CE, the Edict of Milan was passed, which allowed Christians to live relatively peacefully in the empire.
Well, that's nice.
So big deal. 300 years after Jesus, now they are allowed to. It's not the official religion, but they're not.
They're not officially persecuted.
Yes.
They were persecuted for a long time. Sometimes harder than other times. But it's nice to have the government say, hey, it's okay to be Christian.
Right. After Constantine, though, several emperors waffled back and forth. There was like 3 or 4, and I was like, basically, it was like this guy reversed it, and then this guy reversed that, and several emperors reversed or waffled back and forth with how tolerant they were of Christians, until Theodosius I began to actively persecute pagans in 381 CE. So about 70 years after the Edict of Milan. So even after this was passed and they were actively being persecuted, again, the pagans who believed in the old pantheon, it lasted for another 500 plus years in small regional ways. Or did it disappear and ever disappear entirely? Dun, dun, dun. We'll never know.
Tricky stuff to know for sure.
Right.
All right. As we talked about before, the Norse also suffered because of Christianity. The North Germanic tribes were often at war with the Romans, and there was definitely some intellectual conflict, or at least the Romans saying, hey, the Germanic people's religion is no good, but not as bad as we'll see with the Celts. The Norse religion lasted longer than the Greek and Roman religions, probably mostly because of their distance from the imperial core. The decline in the Norse religion began in the 11th century.
Wow.
Yeah.
Much later.
And it was mostly missionaries rather than a real conquest, which is kind of cool, kind of impressive that it worked out that way, I guess.
Talking to people nicely.
Yeah. Mostly. Mostly.
Tell me about your mission, Preston. What do you mean mostly? Okay.
I mean,
Did you shake a few people down?
I didn't get to carry a sword as a missionary, so
Too bad.
it was definitely the power of the word or nothing at all. By the 12th century, Christianity was the dominant religion in Scandinavia, and it was after this mass conversion that we received the written Eddas that we have. So, historians believe that the Scandinavians would have been in contact with the Christians much earlier, probably like the 6th century, but their beliefs didn't change until good old Bluetooth.
Are we airdropping things?
Sure.
Okay. Are we airdropping Christianity?
Not in this forum.
Fair.
Good old Harold Bluetooth is where we get the Bluetooth name from. The logo that we all have on our phones is a Norse rune. So his goal was to convert the Danish to Christianity. And other leaders in Norway and Sweden also worked to convert their people, but it took about another 200 years after Bluetooth started his work in Denmark. And of course, the Viking Age that most people associate with all of the Scandinavians were Vikings. That's not how that worked, but the Vikings were a class of people, a professional group that went and did great things. The Viking Age coincided closely with the conversion to Christianity when Scandinavians were traveling a lot, usually taking slaves and whatnot. So Christianity also said, hey, maybe don't do that way. Anyway, converting to Christianity often opened doors for people in marriage and trade. Whether they believed it or not, it was convenient at the time to be Christian. And more people just kind of jumped on the bandwagon.
I mean, we briefly touched on the Holocaust. I mean, that was a time where it was convenient to be not Jewish.
No kidding.
Right? So if it meant your safety to convert to Christianity, this is part of the reason how religions die out.
Well, before the Holocaust, there was so much persecution against the Jews all over Europe. Mm. And the Jewish religion, the Jewish tradition, the Jewish identity persisted. And then it got really, really bad. And I think overall there wasn't a lot of people that said, oh yeah, I'm not Jewish. Because they had up to that point been persecuted and stuck with it anyway.
Yeah, it's such an identity piece.
Yeah.
And it's in all of their stories, this idea of persecution.
Yeah. The Hebrew Bible is full of, it sucks to be Jewish, but it's a lot better when we've got God on our side.
Yeah, you're God's people. Yeah.
So we can't deny it.
On to the Celtic religion. Also a victim of Christianity.
But there's more.
But wait, there's more. So as early as the 1st century, with the Roman conquest of Gaul, so Christianity hasn't even spread yet.
Right.
JC's still warm in his grave. Wait. Never mind.
He was only warm in his grave for a couple of days.
There was an aggressive undertaking to eradicate the Celtic tradition. So though the Romans hadn't accepted Christianity yet, they still did not like these Druids. Druidism in particular was forbidden, and many important temples were destroyed. But there was a resurgence in Celtic paganism until Christianity.
Good old St. Patrick.
Good old St. Patrick. So St. Patrick was one of the first missionaries in Ireland and began in the 5th century. So right around the same time as the Greek and Roman conversion. And he was basically, not him personally, but the conversion was basically done by the 7th century, and Ireland was a very Catholic nation after that.
Yeah. Yeah, all those stories of St. Patrick getting rid of the snakes of Ireland. Pretty sure he was just talking about Druids.
Absolutely, yep. And this is also an interesting one in particular, how the religion, the Celtic paganism, became stories and folklore instead.
Mm-hmm. Which is interesting that the stories persisted that the priests, we talked about this before, that the priests wrote the stories down so that they weren't lost. Kind of interesting. All right, next we have the Egyptians. Again, we're going to blame this on Christianity.
Jesus Christ. Sorry, I'm so sorry. If you don't get that reference, please join our Discord.
Even before Constantine I and the Edict of Milan, Egypt was already becoming a hotbed of Christian activity. There was a pretty sizable Jewish population in Egypt already. The Jews there produced the Septuagint, which is, of course, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And so things got rough for them. The Jews were never popular outside of their home. And so this social position made Christianity pretty appealing to the Jews there. And many Christian writers like Origen and Clement of Alexandria spent their lives in Egypt. And the Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria is the largest and oldest church in Egypt, founded in 42 CE by Mark the Evangelist. And eventually all of these forces, all of these great Christian thinkers in Egypt, gained enough popularity that they kind of just forced out what was left of the Egyptian amalgamation with Greek polytheism in Egypt. Kind of messy, but it was definitely the Christians.
Yes, this went messy, but the most peaceful?
I guess, yeah. You could say that. It was definitely an intellectual conquest.
Yes. As opposed to let's kill all the Druids.
Yes.
You know, we'll get rid of this religion. Dead priests.
I mean, it worked. Not that the goal was good, but the mission was a success.
Yeah, so messy, but exactly. I like the way you spun that intellectual conquest. And the Coptic Orthodox Church is beautiful, and I want to go visit one day. And massive.
Actually, my first non-family connected job when I was living alone as an adult was with an awesome Coptic Orthodox, Egyptian Orthodox family at a pizzeria.
That's amazing.
Right?
I don't know what pizzeria. Is it still around? It's in Saskatchewan.
It's in Alberta, but the pizzeria has since gotten new owners.
No. Too bad.
But super cool family. I really enjoyed hanging out with them.
Yeah. So let's get down to the real point of this podcast, Preston. Is that science is just superior.
The great thing about science is that it is easy to prove a point with sufficient evidence, which is the basis of good science.
Yes.
You can argue all you want about theology. We've got loads of evidence of that if you go into any university library. But science is
You
the
do
bee's
this
knees.
thing, you do it 15 times, you get the same result.
It must
15
be
times.
a solid, reliable fact.
Yeah.
Religious behavior does satisfy needs, but it's not the only thing that can do so. We don't need to have a river god to explain why the river has stopped feeding our community, or to hope that a dry river will flow again. We've mapped the world. We understand the water cycle. We don't need gods for that. We get it. We don't need to personify the lightning and thunder with good old Thor to understand the deadly power of electricity. Just maybe don't go outside in a thunderstorm holding a giant metal rod.
But you can lick a battery.
Yeah, that's fine.
That's fine.
That's probably the safest way to learn about electricity, other than rubbing a really old TV right after you turn it off.
Oh, that was always fun. Where it's like fuzzy. Yeah.
Yeah. I've played with electricity so much that when my wife tries to shock me with static, I feel it half the time.
Wow, that's concerning.
It's probably not a good thing.
Electra?
Those are two very different Marvel characters. Only one of them uses electricity. And I would say, no, okay. I'm not Electro or Electra.
Okay. Disappointing, but I'll keep you guys posted if I see anything weird from Preston. Yeah, so science has helped us move past the utility of a lot of specific traditions. If, we've mentioned a few times, if you don't need it to organize or explain things, and there's better ways to organize and better ways to explain, humans at their core are lazy as fuck.
Right?
And
It took us forever to climb up Mount Olympus, but when we got there were no gods.
But my point is, we're so lazy, we are very efficient.
Yes.
So again, if there's a better way to organize or explain, we will do it.
Mm-hmm. Took us forever to fly. Found out that there's no angels in the clouds. Otherwise, we'd have a much messier plane to clean when it lands.
I mean, I'm sure we hit the odd bird.
Oh, for sure.
I don't want to know. I feel like I'd be really... I hit a bird with my car once. I was very upset.
No kidding.
Yeah. Not too well with that. Yeah, so that's why religions die. Because science is... No.
If any religion relies too much on a thing that is objectively a matter of fact, and then you can prove that fact wrong, if that's the basis of the religion must die.
Yeah.
And other than that, it's mostly a replacement thing. I still don't think there's enough evidence for the model of magic into polytheism, into monotheism, to science. Because most of the religions that we look at that eventually end up as, or most of the populations we look at that end up as monotheistic, they didn't evolve from polytheism to monotheism.
Yeah.
It was a hostile takeover in almost every situation.
Well, and to my point of, science being more efficient and more accurate, 2,000 years ago, Christianity was more efficient and more accurate than these big pantheons of gods, right? It worked better for society.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you believe Jesus is the Messiah or not, in a very violent time in our history, hearing love your neighbor probably was a lot more effective and efficient to get things done.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
So I think for any of these, it's just whatever moves society as a whole forward the best. And I think that's why secularism is becoming so popular, because we can't satisfy all these different religious beliefs.
Yeah.
That a secular path satisfies most people's needs is where we're headed. But I could be wrong.
Yeah, we've talked about secularism before, and the reality is that if we have any one religious population ruling over all of its neighbors, everyone's going to have a bad time. We need secularism. We need to have a society built on what is good for the whole, not just what fits the religious doctrines of one group.
Yep. Any other final thoughts?
I think we've pretty much nailed down how most of these groups that we've been talking about have been kind of cleared out
Squashed.
Mostly by Christians.
Yes.
But there's always a little bit of complication to that too, especially, for example, the Celts, where they were villainized before the Christians hit the stage. That's kind of the deal. That's where they went.
Away. Just went on vacation, little Timmy.
One, the vacation is a fair enough word, since we see resurgence of a lot of these ideas.
Yep. Thanks, Internet.
Yes, being able to help people communicate across vast distances and share ideas, no matter the quality of their goodness, because there's a lot of bad ideas being spread out too. There's a lot of interesting ideas becoming more popular.
Yeah. Hey, Preston, speaking of the internet.
Oh man, we've got such a great presence on the internet. We've got Discord, where you can chat, share memes. We post pictures of a lot of the things that we talk about, so you can have a visual representation of what's going on.
Preston's going to post cat nipples this week, apparently.
I've already posted cats and almost had one with nipples
Well,
for our last episode.
yep.
And by last episode, I definitely mean a few episodes back. Time is
most
weird since the
recent.
recording time versus release time. Anyway, we've also got YouTube, we've got Facebook, Instagram, we've also got Patreon, where we would love to see some of your support. And we've also got a shop on Spreadshirt.
With some new releases.
Oh man, I'm so
boy.
excited for our newest release.
If you want to see what we're talking about, check out our Spreadshirt.
Good old St. Bernard.
And we will see you in 2 weeks' time.
Peace be with you.
A state of spiritual enlightenment and salvation called
By the late Middle Ages, the Christian prophecy had fulfilled itself.
God is near.